Hey everyone, welcome back to another video lecture. This time around we're going to be focusing on the experience of Japanese Americans during World War II, namely their experience in the Japanese internment camps and how they got to that point. Love this picture in the background. You've got all these kids of different backgrounds. You got white kids, African Americans, you got Hispanic Americans, you have Japanese Americans, you got the little kid in the corner over here who's saying the Pledge of Allegiance like he's having a heart attack. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And you got like this kid right here who's like, oh, what the heck's going on here, man? But it's just a cool picture. I just really like it because it really says a lot about who we are as a country. It's a melting pot that we have all these different people coming together, and it's just a big part of who we are as a people. It's part of our identity. And it's just unfortunate during World War II that you have a group of people who are going to be targeted for their ethnic background, and they're going to be sent to relocation centers for what a lot of people are going to consider as very unjust reasons. And that's one thing I want you guys to think about as we go through this, is to think about the constitutionality of the relocation. I'm pretty sure I gave you guys a handout. Should be, I think it's the last one, and it has the Bill of Rights on there, and I also put some other stuff from the Constitution in there. So as we go through this, you should be looking at all of those things that are in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution to determine whether or not what happened to African Americans, whether it was legit or not. Did the federal government have the authority to take a group of people and physically remove them from an area and exclude them from an area and put them somewhere else? So that's what we're going to be looking at. So the question really becomes, where does this all come from? Why is it that Roosevelt felt the necessity to implement such a drastic measure? Well, of course, Pearl Harbor is going to be really the big thing that is going to set most Americans on fire. Pearl Harbor is kind of an interesting thing because you have this major event. It's what's going to bring the United States into World War II, obviously. You have thousands of Americans that were killed and injured. But there was no blatant call to do anything against the Japanese Americans right away. It was almost like there was, it's kind of like it happened, and life kind of went on for a little bit afterwards. But you begin to see the media, you begin to see politicians, they begin to kind of, I think, invoking a sense of fear within the American population. And I think it's this fear that just kind of overcame everything. And there's this fear that you have these Japanese Americans that are in the United States, and by the way, there are only maybe 115, 120,000 or so Japanese Americans in the United States. That the fear is that you have the Americans thinking that the Japanese American population, that you can't trust them, that they're spies, are going to be sabotaging the United States, are going to be forming an alliance with the Japanese, and the Japanese are going to invade the West Coast, and the Japanese American population, because they're so loyal to the emperor, that they're going to come together in this alliance, and it's going to wreak havoc on the West Coast of the United States. So there's, I think, this irrational fear that was put out there, and I think we see that today to a certain extent by certain politicians, Donald Trump, that there are certain groups of people in the world and in our country that we need to fear, and certain things need to be done to quote unquote protect us from these different groups of people, like building a wall or deporting, creating national lists of certain groups of people, whatever. So that paranoia that we see kind of going on today was huge when it came to the Japanese American population. So, you look at the perception of Japanese Americans, where it came from really was, what happened was you had this hatred and fear towards Japanese people, and all of those fears that Americans had, and just that feeling of animosity towards the Japanese is going to be transferred to the Japanese American population here in the United States. So white people didn't trust Japanese Americans. They didn't care how assimilated most Japanese Americans were, which, by the way, most of them were pretty well assimilated into American culture. They were, businessmen. They owned shops. They had homes and mortgages. Their kids went to school, with other white kids and stuff. So I mean, the Japanese American population, like I said, was pretty assimilated, but the white American population they didn't trust the Japanese Americans simply because of their fears that they would ally with the Japanese. So no confidence in Japanese American loyalty whatsoever. And you can see this with the propaganda that comes out during the time. So here you have this propaganda poster where you've got this Japanese guy looking like a monster. I mean, he's got fangs. It's crazy. And he's got his hand around the beautiful American maiden woman. He looks like he might have a knife up against her neck. This is the horror. Okay, the horror are the Japanese, and we don't want this coming to the United States. And all those Japanese Americans, this is what they are right here. So, like I said, this idea of what Japanese people are is going to be transferred to our Japanese American population. And again, I'll show you a bunch of propaganda posters and whatnot that will address that particular situation. Hey, but what you can do to keep this horror from your home is to invest 10% in war bonds. So basically buy some war bonds and prevent the situation from happening. So yeah, so no confidence within the Japanese American community. Alright, what else? Okay, so here's some propaganda stuff that I have. So this was kind of funny. The other day, I know that the high school had like a birthday celebration thing for Dr. Seuss, and I had commented to a student, I'm like, oh yeah, Dr. Seuss is actually fairly racist. And I remember that person was kind of like, what? Like, yeah, he actually was a political cartoonist for a while before he did his Green Eggs and Ham and Cat in the Hat and all of that. And a lot of his propaganda posters that come out of, or political cartoons that come out of World War II, they use very racist stereotypes of Japanese. The horn-rimmed glasses and the pug nose and the buck teeth. And what he's using here is he's using the image of Tojo. He was like the military dictator of Japan. And so this image kind of became the stereotype of all Japanese people. And it's rather racist. And we may think it's kind of silly today or whatnot, but compared to the blackface stuff that I showed you with Jim Crow, it's just really the same thing. This is the blackface of Japanese Americans. So this stuff is really, it's pretty racist, just like you have with the blackface stuff that came out of Jim Crow. And I have a couple more of these. This one is kind of funny. You've got like these annoying bugs, these annoying mosquitoes as the main dictators of the time. So you've got Hitler here, and this is Tojo. Could be Hirohito, but I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be Tojo. And then I love little Mussolini over here, because Mussolini was pretty worthless when it came to World War II, and so he's just this kind of little annoying gnat. But how do you get rid of this? Well, you got to get rid of it by, of course, buying U.S. defense bonds and stamps. But we're looking at the flit. The flit basically is like bug spray. It's like Raid or something like that. So the Raid would be defense bonds, and that would get rid of the annoying pest of Hitler, Tojo / Hirohito, and Mussolini. And then there's another one, again using the same racial stereotypes of the pug nose and the buck teeth. So the old tobacco juice where it counts. And we'll do a lot of bombing of Tokyo before we actually decide to use atomic bombs. Man who draw his back too hard, sit down and sing very, very slow. Poking fun at the way Japanese speak. Getting closer and closer to war with the United States, with the Japanese expanding out into the Pacifics in search for empire and also for strategic materials. And especially once we embargo oil in particular, you've got the Japanese who are going to continue to expand and expand and expand. So again, the more that they expand, the closer they're going to be getting into that hot water with the United States. this one is just absolutely ludicrous, and I love to talk about it because it's just so ridiculous. You know, let's be honest with ourselves. I'm white. I can't tell different Asian ethnicities from one another. I taught in Brea for many years, as you guys know, and we had a fairly large Asian population, and yeah, I couldn't tell who was Korean or Vietnamese or Chinese or Japanese. During World War II, it was kind of important to know for the U.S. population because we actually were allied with the Chinese, and we wanted to help them out. You know, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria. They had gone into China proper. We wanted to help our little Chinese friends, and a really big part of this as well, and this might be synthesis, I'm not sure, but, another reason why we wanted to be allies with China was economic, which is going to be our open door policy. So we didn't like the fact that the Japanese were taking over these large chunks of China because, again, we were afraid that that would be a threat to our trade with China. So the problem is how do we tell the difference? Again, most of us white people were like, I don't know, they're just Asian, right? That's just kind of like the collective term for everyone, Asian. So you had these articles, and I've got a couple of these. I'm pretty sure this one came from Time magazine. It was around 1941, 1942 when this came out. So how to tell the Japs from the Chinese. Angry citizens victimize allies with emotional outbursts at enemy. So, Pearl Harbor happens, and, like I said, there was a period of calm, whatever, but things kind of get kind of crazy with the media and politicians talking about all of this, and you can't trust the Japanese and whatever. So you began to have white Americans begin to terrorize, to a certain extent, anyone who is Asian, okay? But we want to make sure that, we don't target the wrong person. So you got to be able to tell who the Chinese are from the Japs. And by the way, Japs is it's a fairly derogatory term that Americans used for the Japanese. Another one was nips. That one's probably worse than Japs. Sometimes I show a cartoon, and you can look it up on YouTube. It's really bad. It's really racist. It's called Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips. Nip is short for Nippon, it just means Japan, but it's still used as a derogatory term. But anyways, let's figure out. This will probably be the most important lesson that you learn all year long, how to tell the Chinese from the Japanese. All right, let's check it out. All right, so the Chinese dude is up here. The Japanese dude is down here. Okay, so look at their skin. If you see an Asian person with parchment yellow complexion, so think of like a piece of parchment paper. So if they're that color, well, then they're Chinese. If you see an Asian person with an earthly yellow complexion, well, of course, then that's a Japanese person. Chinese have more frequent epicanthic folds. That's what gives the eye that almond shape, or what most insensitive people would say is slanted eyes. So the Chinese have more frequent epicanthic fold, or more almond-shaped eyes, whereas the Japanese have a less frequent epicanthic fold. So they have wider eyes. So you see an Asian person walking around with wide eyes, the person's Japanese. If they're a little bit more almond-shaped, then there must be Chinese. The Chinese have a higher bridge on their nose. The Japanese, of course, have flatter noses. And the Chinese never, ever have rosy cheeks. Never. The Japanese, though, sometimes have rosy cheeks. I guess the Chinese never blush, because they never have rosy cheeks. Doesn't this make sense, guys? This is like genius. We should do this for all groups. Let's see, what else we got here? The Chinese have lighter facial bones. The Japanese have massive cheek and jawbones, and you can really see that. I don't know what that came from. You can really see that with this guy's really broad, massive cheeks and jawbones. Alright. What else we got? The Chinese have longer, narrow faces, and the Japanese have broader, shorter faces. So it all makes sense. Oh, and we can't forget the facial hair either. The Japanese, they have heavy beards. Like you see with this guy, it's a pretty heavy beard. Well, it's a mustache, actually, but whatever. And then, of course, the Chinese, they really just have scant beards. They just can't grow hair, I guess, that well. I don't know. There was another one of these that I have, like I said, and it lists some other stuff on there. So it says things like the Japanese, that they laugh at the most awkward moments. So if you see an Asian person and like all of a sudden they're just like, well, they must be Japanese. Okay. Chinese people, one of the things that supposedly they do when they walk is they shuffle. So I'll give you an example of that. You probably can't see me too well, but they shuffle. So now you guys are all experts on the differences between the Chinese and the Japanese. So you'll never get that wrong again. So think about all those friends that you have that are Chinese and Japanese. Now you can say with confidence, I know why you are. Because you have a parchment yellow complexion. You're Chinese. How interesting. How ridiculous. Alright, looking at some more propaganda posters of how Japanese were portrayed. They were portrayed as rats. You see a lot of propaganda posters. You think about a rat. A rat is someone that you can't really trust. You rat someone out. You're like tattling on them. So, again, you want to make sure that you don't tell the rats any sensitive information. Because we all know that the Japanese Americans here, if you tell them something with sensitive information, they're all going to go to Emperor Hirohito and they're going to tell them everything because they're, allied with them, whatever. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But that's just what was going on during the time. Here's another one. Don't talk. Rats have big ears. Here's one of Tojo. Again, Tojo was the military leader of Japan. So Tojo, like careless worker. So you got to be careful. You can't say things because, if you work with Japanese Americans or they are your neighbors, they're going to spy on you. They're going to be listening for conversations where you may be talking about Roosevelt or the war, or I don't know, whatever. But you just have to be very careful about what you say because you can't trust them. Okay? And so you just got to be careful. And then this is the enemy. You look at how the Japanese are portrayed in these posters. I mean, they're, again, like monsters. And that's very deliberate. I mean, I think we talked about this during World War I. You can't portray your enemy as your neighbor because then you're not going to want to fight them. So you're going to want to make sure that you portray the enemy as despisable. Again, you got the woman there. He's going after her with a knife. He's just not a nice guy. And he looks like he's really mean. So, and why I'm bringing all this up again, because as I said earlier, it's important for you guys to understand that, all these propaganda posters against the Japanese, all the same, feelings that people had towards the Japanese, the animosities and stuff like that, they're all going to just simply be transferred to our Japanese American population, regardless of the fact that the Japanese are the Japanese and the Japanese Americans are the Japanese Americans. It didn't really matter for most Americans. So because of all of this kind of mass hysteria about the potential of our Japanese American population allying with the Japanese in a potential attack on the West Coast, Roosevelt felt compelled enough to do something about it. And he had I think most Americans are going to support him. I think the government as a whole supported him, and we'll talk later about where the Supreme Court stands on this. But Roosevelt's going to issue what's called Executive Order 9066, and this is one of those things that you absolutely have to know for this class. With Executive Order 9066, essentially what happens is that the government has the ability to exclude a group of people from a particular area out of military necessity. So putting that into terms that we're talking about, essentially with 9066, the federal government had the ability to take a group of people that were viewed as potentially dangerous, Japanese Americans, and exclude them from a certain area, the West Coast. And again, the fear was that after the Pearl Harbor invasion, that the West Coast was next in all of this. So to prevent the Japanese American community allying with the Japanese, out of military necessity, it became important to put that Japanese American community somewhere else. And that will be in the interior part of the United States. So to exclude them from the West Coast and to put them into the interior. The War Relocation Authority, and that's a term that you want to remember, the War Relocation Authority basically then this was created to put 9066 into action, essentially. So the War Relocation is going to be responsible then for this whole program of what's called internment or relocation. And again, that's an interesting question as well, just kind of skipping ahead. What do you call these things? Are they relocation centers? Are they internment camps? Are they concentration camps? And this is something that will be debated by Japanese Americans as well as the federal government. The federal government, of course, is going to use the term relocation center, and it really does make sense, largely because it's a neutral term. Why would the federal government not want these to be called concentration camps? Well, there's this little thing going on in Germany, or all of Europe really, called the Holocaust. And of course, all the Jews are being placed in concentration camps. So, of course, Roosevelt and the federal government doesn't want the world, to think that what the United States is doing is creating the same thing here for Japanese Americans. Okay, so the federal government will say relocation centers, sometimes internment camps. I think most of the Japanese Americans who actually spent time in these camps, they call them concentration camps. If you look at the term, were they concentration camps? Yeah, I mean, did you have a large group of people who were concentrated in a certain area, largely against their will? Yeah, you did. Absolutely. So, I think for the Japanese Americans, I think it makes sense to call them concentration camps because so many of them also are going to disagree with the whole program. This is not something that they signed up for. It wasn't like, they saw these posters, and I'll explain those in a second. It's on the slide. It's not like they saw these things were like, yeah, let's go, I want to put my name down. This sounds like it's fun. It could be like a vacation. No, I mean, these people, what we'll find is that they're going to lose everything. They're going to lose their homes. They're going to lose their businesses, their cars, their possessions. It's terrible. The numbers in terms of how many these people actually went to these camps or centers, again, whatever you want to call them, it varies. And I don't know why the numbers vary. The federal government, they claim somewhere around 120 to 150,000 or so. And then Japanese Americans claim somewhere from about 200 to 250,000. So I like to put it somewhere in the middle. It's probably somewhere around 200,000 or so. Again, I'm not sure why the numbers vary from the federal government and the Japanese American community. Now, when Executive Order 9066 was put into action, the War Relocation Authority placed these posters all over the West Coast. They were in cities everywhere. They were in Seattle, they were in Portland, they were in San Francisco, they were in Los Angeles. And these posters told Japanese Americans what to do. Basically, these are the directions in terms of what is going to happen to you. And note, we're looking at these are all people of Japanese ancestry. So, Japanese nationals, Japanese Americans who are American citizens, it didn't really matter. It was all people of Japanese ancestry. And we're looking at people on the West Coast, and that's kind of an important thing. If you were a Japanese American and you lived in Pennsylvania, this really didn't apply to you. It was excluding Japanese Americans from the West Coast because of the fear of of an invasion of Japan, and that the Japanese and the Japanese Americans would conspire together. So anyways, these posters were put all over the place. You can see this one is local. So this one's from Los Angeles, and it gave them directions on exactly what they were supposed to do, what they were supposed to bring, and so on. Now, you could only bring with you one suitcase. That was it. You couldn't bring anything else. And you only had about up to a week or so, actually, to get all of your belongings in order. And this is how so many people lost everything. If you have a house, you have a mortgage payment, how the heck are you going to be able to pay a mortgage payment while you're in camp? The bank is going to take your house away from you. So it's kind of sad. You've got many people who took advantage of this situation. And if I'm a Japanese American, I got to sell my house. I'm going to sell it for whatever I can get. And there are people out there that, again, are going to take advantage of the situation. They're going to offer these ridiculous offers of way less than what the home or the business is actually worth. And what recourse do the Japanese Americans have? There's nothing. These people weren't brought up in front of a court or anything. This is why you were going to the camps. It was just, it is what it is. You're going. So these people had to put their stuff in order very quickly. And a lot of people ended up selling everything that they had because, life was uncertain for these people. I have read stories that are actually kind of cool where you had neighbors that were very sympathetic to the situation and said, look, don't worry about it. We'll take care of things for you. We will pay your mortgage or your car payment or whatever. We'll keep an eye on all of your stuff, because looting also was problematic for people, the Japanese Americans who left, be it their businesses or their homes. So you did have some neighbors that looked out for their neighbors, and some of them made payments on their homes and stuff, and they just kept an eye on things, which I think is really cool. But for the most part, these people lost just about everything. They could only take with them what they could put in one suitcase, and I always thought that'd be a really cool assignment, and no, not extra credit, to have you guys bring in a suitcase with, if you were put in this situation, what would you bring? One suitcase and one suitcase only. Just think about that. It's interesting. Maybe we'll do something like that after the AP test. So here's a map of the relocation centers. The closest one to us is at Manzanar, and I'll be showing you some photographs of that in a little bit. So Manzanar, if you've ever been up to Mammoth, which is like right around here, so it's like right off the same highway. I think it's 395, if I'm not mistaken. This is where most of the people in Southern California ended up going to. I do have a friend that I used to work with. His grandfather went to Poston. Tule Lake is kind of notable because obviously there's going to be a lot of Japanese Americans who are going to say, this is a bunch of crap, that my civil rights are being violated, and they don't take this very lightly. They're conscientious resistors. A lot of those people who were quote-unquote problematic in the camps, they didn't listen. Those that may have neglected to go to the camp, and we'll talk about some of those people later, if they were eventually taken to camp, a lot of times they were taken to Tule Lake. There were riots that happened in some of the camps. So some of those people who were involved in those types of things, they were taken to Tule Lake. So Tule Lake was kind of like the center for all of those objectors to the system. And again, keep in mind, we're looking at, notice how most of these camps are in the interior part of the West. So 9066, like I said, it was to remove the Japanese Americans from the West Coast and then to put them inland. And again, if you lived over here somewhere in Virginia or whatever, this didn't really apply to you. And I don't think there were that many Japanese Americans living on the East Coast. Some of you may be asking, what about German Americans or Italian Americans? Kind of interesting. We talked about World War I and how that was a problem. How there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in particular. During World War II, you didn't really see that. There were about 5,000 or so German Americans and Italian Americans who were put into one of these camps. But for the most part, it wasn't really something that applied to them. So let's look at some photographs of what it was like for these people. For those Japanese Americans who live locally in this area, they went to Santa Anita racetrack where they were quote unquote processed, and they were they were split into groups and they found out which of the camps that they were going to go to. So during that whole process, they stayed at the Santa Anita racetrack. I think it was about for a week or so. So you have these entire families you can see that are there, and they actually stayed. These are horse stalls, so they stayed inside of the horse stalls, and basically they slept upon beds of hay. And you can see that it was wet, so it was raining, and you can imagine the smell of horse manure, which probably permeated, these horse stalls. It had to have been absolutely miserable for these people. Again, I always think about the kids. It's so sad. I mean, these little kids they're just innocent. I mean, all these people are innocent victims, but I just really feel for the children. Again, at these areas where people were kind of sorted out, again, Santa Anita Racetrack being one of those areas, they were tagged, and that's what these things are. And these tags basically said which of the camps that they would be going to. Entire families stay together. It wasn't like the federal government was trying to, split families up. So they did try to keep everyone together. Really, the only time that a family might be split up is if you had a conscientious objector in the family. They might take that person directly to Tule Lake. And here are some people who are either getting on or getting off the train. I'm not really sure which one it is. One of the things that the federal government had consistently stated about these camps was that they're not prisoners. They're free to do as they please. Well, I don't understand that personally, because these internees basically are under the 24-hour watch of the military. And you'll see in all these photographs of the camps that the military is present, and a lot of times they're pointing their gun at them. So, the government's saying that they're not prisoners, but I don't know. I mean, you look at, they do not have freedom of movement. When we talk about the various civil liberties that we all take for granted, the idea of freedom of speech, for instance, and freedom of press, the internees, they could create their own newspapers. However, they were censored. Many Japanese Americans were Buddhists, and you could not practice Buddhism in the camps. You could not freely assemble how you wanted to. Looking at the Second Amendment, obviously the Japanese Americans did not have the right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures, these troops could search and take whatever they wanted to, essentially, from these people. It happened in their homes. A lot of times after the Japanese Americans left to go to camp, the FBI or just local authorities would go into their homes and they'd ransack it looking for quote-unquote evidence that they were somehow tied to Japan or the emperor or whatever. The Sixth Amendment, the idea of due process rights. Were these people being treated fairly under fair laws? As I said earlier, these people, they didn't have the ability to stand in front of a judge and say, why am I here? These people, they had no right to counsel, so they had no lawyers. They couldn't certainly have jury trials if they couldn't even have a trial. Is this considered cruel and unusual punishment? That'd be the Eighth Amendment. What about privacy rights? Ninth Amendment. So, you could make arguments that a lot of the civil liberties that we have contained in the Bill of Rights were violated. However, you also have to keep in mind and ask yourselves the question, this is a very different time. These are extraordinary circumstances that we find ourselves in. None of the rights that we have contained under the Bill of Rights, none of them are absolute. So, in these times where we have extraordinary circumstances, is this okay for the government to do something like this? Okay, that's what you really need to be thinking about and asking yourself. Is this constitutional? And if you say yes or no to that, but you have to kind of look at the time period, the context. You have to look at, we're in the middle of a war. Does the government have the right to do something like this out of military necessity in these types of times? Again, the children always get to me. The looks on their faces of, they look so scared. Although this girl out here looks like she's having a good time. I doubt that. And that's one of the things you'll see quite a bit actually is, I think that you got to make a bad situation good. And I think a lot of these Japanese Americans, they wanted to present themselves as loyal Americans. And they're not going to brood on this. They're going to do what they feel is an act of loyalty in just doing this. But again, not all Japanese Americans are going to believe that. Love this photograph as well. Again, it just one of those ones that just kind of gets to you, where it's like, all right, here you have these people going off to camp. They're American citizens. You got the little kid waving the American flag. I am an American. They have the peace sign, or V for victory, whichever it was. Is this right? Is this right for the federal government to embark upon a program like this and uproot these people? I mean, think about these kids. A week ago, before this, these little kids were in school with their classmates, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, learning about history and learning how to write and do math and whatnot. And now look at the situation they find themselves in. And they're still patriotic about it. You got to admire their resilience. And then we get to the sentiment of Americans. And this was something that you saw often on the West Coast. It's very similar, I think, to what you might see in the South, when it comes to African Americans and the Jim Crow segregation that went on. And just the look on this guy's face, he might be a Trump supporter today. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Japs keep out. You are not wanted. Again, this was the sentiment of most Americans, and Roosevelt had a lot of support for 9066. And these are rational fears that people had. So here are some Japanese Americans in the camp. And again, Roosevelt, the government, War Relocation Authority, they're going to say that these people are not prisoners. Well, again, why do you have the barbed wire fences? Why do you have the soldiers aiming their guns at these people if they're not prisoners? This is Manzanar. The backdrop for Manzanar is absolutely gorgeous, by the way. It sits right in front of the Sierra Mountains. If you're familiar with Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain in the contiguous United States, Mount Whitney, you can see that from Manzanar. So this is the entrance for Manzanar, and this shows the barracks. So these are what people actually lived in. And again, like I said, you always see soldiers with their guns ready to go if necessary. Here's inside of a barrack. Again, you might say, oh, that's not that bad. Well, I mean, you got to really consider the situation. Do these people really want to be here? These people basically lost everything that they had. And again, making the best out of a bad situation. Look at the floorboards, and there's gaps in them. You can see the gaps in the door in the back over here. The weather for Manzanar is extreme. You have the summers can be extremely hot, and the winters can be very, very, very cold. So, I've read stories of people that, and you can see all these barracks here. None of the barracks had their own bathrooms. So there were actual barracks that were just like for showering and restrooms and things like that. So if you were in this barrack and the bathroom was way down here, you had to walk that whole distance. And again, it was so cold. I've read stories that people would say they would go and they would shower, and they didn't have any mechanism to dry their hair or anything. So by the time they walked back to their barrack, they actually had icicles that were on their hair. So really, really extreme situations in terms of weather. And a lot of these people weren't, prepared for that. A lot of these people at Manzanar were from LA. You think about us, we freak out if it rains, So it's a totally different environment for these people. Got that. Working. One interesting thing about the camps was that you had so many Japanese Americans that were put into these camps that it really affected agriculture, especially here in California, because a lot of Japanese Americans worked in agriculture. So the federal government actually found it necessary to routinely release for days or maybe hours, some of these internees to go work in the fields because it was necessary to keep production up of the agricultural products for the war effort. A lot of cases, the Japanese Americans in the camps were forced to do work that they didn't necessarily want to do, but they had to because, again, they had guns pointing at them in a lot of cases. Here's an enclosure, and I don't really know exactly what's going on here, but the fact, again, you have enclosure number 10. So you have this whole area that is enclosed, and these people, like I said, they didn't have the ability of freedom of movement. If they couldn't go, for a walk in the hills if they wanted to. They had to be behind these fences and barbed wire 24/7, and again, they were constantly under guard. They were not allowed to assemble. And a lot of times, if you had assemblies of certain groups of people that were known maybe as agitators or resistors, that would be broken up right away. There were some really crafty Japanese Americans in the camps who used a lot of the scrap wood and metal to construct things to make their lives better in the barracks. So all this scrap wood comes from the construction of these barracks, and it was just laying around. So you have some carpenters and some woodworkers and stuff who are able to take these materials and they make beds out of them and couches. So again, just trying to make their situation a little bit better than it was. I don't really have anything on here in eating situations, but with eating, everything was rationed out to the Japanese Americans, and in a lot of cases, this was a source of contention because a lot of times, like sugar and coffee and whatnot, the soldiers would actually hoard all of that for themselves, and very little would be left to the Japanese Americans in the camps. This is Manzanar during the winter. Education did take place in some of the camps. From my understanding, once federal money kind of dwindles a little bit, that the education will kind of dwindle along with it. But you do have kids still getting some bit of an education while they're in camp. So that's more positive than anything else. They had, by the way, they had things like, they had dances, they had radio they can listen to. So it wasn't like, these people were, chained to their beds or anything like that. They did have some semblance of I don't know if freedom is quite the right word, but yep, they did have some comforts, I guess, comforts of life that I think made life better. Here are some women who, again, are just trying to make the best out of a bad situation. So they're trying to make their barracks more like home. And you can see some of the things that people bring with them, some personal items over here. This looks like a photograph maybe of one of their family members that was in the military. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Here's another barrack that was made pretty nicely. And again, it's interesting to see what people choose to bring with them. So some people chose to bring blankets and quilts and different fabrics and lamps and candles and things that remind them of home. This looks like it could be some type of a shrine or something. I'm not really sure. But again, they couldn't practice Buddhism, so I don't think that's I'm not sure. I don't think it's a picture of the Buddha. All right, military. This was one way for the Japanese Americans to really, again, prove their loyalty. They shouldn't have to prove their loyalty, but the fact of the matter is they're kind of put to the test during this time period. So one thing that's really fascinating about after Pearl Harbor was, again, this fear that you can't trust the Japanese Americans. So immediately the federal government is going to categorize Japanese Americans as what's called 4C non-draftable enemy aliens. So what that meant was that Japanese Americans could not join the military. They were prevented because of, again, the fears of the people in the government, that they would not be loyal to the United States. Well, eventually over time this changes, and you have the creation of the 442nd, which was a Japanese American unit. It was about, how many? It's about 3,800 or so Japanese Americans that served in the military during World War II. And kind of interesting, probably not shocking, they were not allowed to serve in the war in the Pacific because, again, the fear that they may actually ally with the Japanese. So they fought a lot, like in the African front, and then also in Italy and the rest of Europe as well. The 442nd actually is currently even still the most decorated unit for the length of their service and size. Their casualty rate is super high. You could be, if you were in the 442nd, you could expect it to be a casualty more than once. Again, casualty does not mean being killed necessarily. It could be just being hurt. One of the things that's just so disturbing about this is, the fact that here you have these guys overseas fighting for their country, yet their family back here in the United States are locked up in these internment camps. So, it's a fact of reality during the war. All these people wanted to do was to prove themselves as American citizens, which they really, again, should not have had to do. But again, that's just what happened during the time. So that's the 442nd. There's a picture of some Japanese Americans in the 442nd, and then a family holding a picture of their son who was in the 442nd. And again, these people are actually in an internment camp. And that brings us to the loyalty questionnaire. After a while, the War Relocation Authority decided to issue a loyalty questionnaire to really figure out, to try to discern the loyal from the disloyal. And we'll talk about this later, but one of the things that the federal government is going to say that needed to happen, and why these camps existed in the first place, and why it was done so hastily, is simply because it's too hard to discern the loyal from the disloyal. You can't do it right away. So once the camps are established, then the federal government can issue these loyalty questionnaires, and they can, through these questionnaires, determine who is loyal and disloyal. The problem is the questionnaires. The questionnaires are very poorly written. There are two questions in particular that were super problematic. Questions number 27 and 28. So let's look at those questions. Number 27 said, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States in combat duty wherever ordered? And, I think for a lot of people, they're like, yeah, sure, whatever. Yeah, I would love to serve in the military and prove my loyalty and defend my country. But what about those people who are pacifists? Okay, those people who just don't want to serve in the military. Because you don't want to serve in the military, does that mean you're disloyal to your country? Well, that's what number 27 implies. If you say no to that particular question, how does that make you look as a Japanese American? It makes you look like you're disloyal. So number 27 was problematic. If you say yes, okay, yeah, I'm willing to do this, well, then you might get drafted, and then you're like, I don't want to do this. But if you say no, then it's like, they're going to think I'm disloyal. So it's a catch-22 situation. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't when it comes to answering this question. It's the same thing with question number 28. With question number 28, it says, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Well, what the heck does that mean? Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, yeah, sure. I'll swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America. Absolutely. I do that every day. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, whatever. So yeah, sure, I can do that. faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign domestic forces. Yeah, I'll do, whatever I can. I may not want to join the military, but I'll do my part. I'll do what I need to do. And then I think the third part is the problematic one. And forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization. So basically it's saying, are you going to swear that you will forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? What does that imply? That implies that you, at some point in time, were actually having some type of an allegiance to the Japanese emperor or some other foreign government, okay? And it doesn't matter how you answer this. If you say yes to all of this, okay, again, that last part, basically it's, if you say yes to that last part, then what that means is that it's saying that, yes, I agree that at some point I did have an allegiance to the Japanese emperor, but I don't anymore. Well, what if you say no, then, to this? So, no, I'm not going to swear unqualified allegiance to the United States, and I'm not going to say that I'm going to defend the United States from any and all attack. I'm not going to forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor. If you say no to that, well, then that really makes it look like you're disloyal. But here's the thing. I may agree with the first and second part of that, but I'm not going to say yes to the third part of that because I never had allegiance to the Japanese emperor. I am an American citizen. So the fact that I would have to say yes to that is completely ridiculous. And I'm going to say no out of, principle. However, what does that make me look like? It makes me look like a schmuck. Okay, it makes me look like I'm disloyal. So it's a problem. So you had people who said yes to both of those, who just want to kind of come off as being loyal. I'm just loyal. I'm going to do whatever I need to say, And then you have the people who are like, wait a minute, I shouldn't even have to answer these questions at all. So I'm going to say no to both of them. Those people became known as no-nos, actually. And the no-nos became, in the eyes of the federal government, became problematic. They became potential resistors, objectioners. So, these no-no people really had to watch themselves because a lot of them will be taken to places like Tule Lake, like I have down here. So the no-nos were transferred to segregated areas because they were seen as potentially being disloyal. One of the unfortunate things that also happens is, the people who said yes to those questions, 27, 28, tended to be of the older generations, and the no-nos tended to be of the younger generations. And there's these different terms on here that I have all defined for you. So you have the Issei. The Issei were Japanese nationals. So they're like the older generation that was born in Japan and immigrated to the United States. And then you have the Nisei. So the Nisei, these are the children of the Issei. And the Nisei are American citizens. They were born here. And again, most of the people in the camps are Nisei. And then you have the Kibe, which are people who were Nisei, so born in the United States, but they were sent to Japan for their education. So they were called the Kibe. Again, both of these groups tended to be more of your conscientious objectors. They tended to be younger. And unfortunately, what happened with this is you did have then divisions that were made in the camps where you had the older people against the younger people and vice versa. Remember we talked about the JACL on another day, the Japanese American Citizens League. This group actually was more conservative, and they really tried to push everyone to say yes to both 27 and 28. Again, the JACL was very much so, we are American citizens, but we're going to do whatever we need to do to prove our loyalty. So the JACL really did try to get everyone to say yes and yes. And again, the younger people really got irritated with the JACL. Again, it caused divisions, physical clashes between the yes and the no-nos, and so on. So you had these divisions that were created within the camps, which is rather unfortunate. And that brings us to this photograph, which I think is amazing. It sums up everything, I think, beautifully. You have a Japanese-American business, and the owner of this business, he was being sent to the camps. So he ended up having to sell his business, again, through no fault of his own. I am an American. And I think that really sums up everything. These people were American citizens, and should they have been subjected to this type of a government program? And again, the constitutionality of this is something that it's something we have to discuss, because potentially something like this could happen again. You know, and it's scary when you are looking at some of these political candidates, again, who are talking about things like, as I mentioned earlier, like rounding up certain groups of people and putting them on lists and deporting them and whatnot, building walls and stuff like that. It's disturbing. You know, can something like this happen again? So that's what we're going to be looking at. I think this is the last slide. Yes. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next video lecture. Is we're going to be talking about the constitutionality of this program. Does the government have the right to do something like this? So until then, adios. Have a fantastic day, afternoon, evening, whatever it happens to be. And always thinking about you. Peace. V for victory. Later, Gator.